have this powerful story in your family, and a history many people don't know, and you chose to tell it as fiction. Why fiction?
The best way to begin to answer that question is to actually start with my research process. I was lucky enough to be able to interview my mother for about 2 years. This is before she died. She died in 2010. And it was a richly rewarding experience. I learned a lot more about the Karen people, a lot more of the details of her life in Burma. For example, I learned that for hundreds of years before the 1800s, when the British conquered the area that's now modern Burma, the Karens were enslaved by the ethnic Burmans. And so I learned some of the history, some of the details, but what was absent from my mother's narrative was the internal. What the emotional toll was. It was very difficult for her to talk about that. Even her motivations. So one of the things that I particularly love about fiction is that it's a leap from the self, from the tyranny of the self, if you will, into, both as a writer and as a reader, into the consciousness of others. When we're reading about characters, when we're writing about characters other than ourselves, it's a very empathic experience, where we're inhabiting another consciousness. And it's such a consolation for me, because in life we actually never ever have that experience, even if we're very close to someone else. We can never fully be doused in their consciousness, and all the layers of consciousness that and perception that we experience going through the world. So when I was interviewing my mother, it became that much clearer to me that I needed to follow my literary instincts and make that sort of empathic leap into her consciousness and the consciousnesses of her family members.
Fiction, a little bit power Coppola mo ata le coplo ata tuba pelava di depan ko itu ke to tu kila mo le buku do wane do awa interview do ti kwa ti do da ta kita ku ti depan do la kini da awa kwewe do ke do kiwe ala li tu di do pa aga kini phawa do ti nyamani lo.
You talk about the tension between the public and the private self in the book, in both Benny and Ken's decisions along family and duty, and in Louise's decisions as well. It makes me think of something that Awa and I had discussed when you talked about, often when you were growing up, the tension families felt about whether their daughters would be in beauty pageants, right? This performative aspect in your work, but also the cost involved. So do you mind talking a little bit about that?
I was born in 1975, and I live in the south part in Burma, and there's a lot of Korean villages over there, and we always has to fear, and the area that we live, that they call a brown area, which is there's no rule and law, so they can do whatever they want. So, growing up in Korean families, we always have to fear. Even though we have ability to do something, we have something that we can show the people that we can do, or talented. We always afraid to bring them up, because when we bring them up, and it becomes like a view for the military, and then they always attempt to do something back to us. So most of the people, they just stay quiet.
Can you talk about, as a writer, when you're writing those scenes as Benny and Ken and Louisa navigate this, right? This desire between safety for their family and something bigger.
This was a theme that I was thinking about all the time when I was writing the book, the intersection, the collision, if you will, between the private and the public realms. I talked a little bit about my interests, and most literary novelists' interests being in consciousness. And I want to give you a kind of a concrete example of what I meant. In order to make, and to address your question, Louisa, in order to make these family members into characters, it was very important to distill them, if you will, into almost a central affliction. So my mother was a fighter. Her father was a fighter. And in order to be fighters, in a way they couldn't look at what was afflicting them within. But that was my job as a novelist, in order to begin to distill them into characters. My grandfather, as I mentioned, was orphaned. I also had this little tidbit that he was a boxer in Calcutta. He became a boxer. In fact, he was very proud of the fact that he won, I guess, the intercollegiate boxing championship. And as a novelist, that was interesting to me, because I thought, well, kind of, when confronted by the blows of life, being orphaned, being stateless, being communityless, his instinct was to throw a counterpunch. That was interesting to me as a novelist. But also, actually, he was sent to an Anglican boarding school in Calcutta. And there he was very much comforted by Christianity and by St. Augustine's idea that God loves each of us as if there were only one of us. And so in addition to this instinct to throw a counterpunch, there was an instinct in him to fall on his knees, if you will, before a God that he felt loved him singularly, or to whom he belonged. This complexity between, on the one hand, an instinct to be cared for and the instinct to defend oneself gave me a key to how someone like my grandfather, for whom the question of belonging was fundamental. He didn't belong. He hoped he belonged to God. And he ultimately felt he really belonged to the Karens who had saved him. So suddenly it made sense why someone like him would risk everything in order to stand up to injustice and, if you will, fight back against history itself. In the book there is this tension too between the idea of history as a sort of blind impersonal force coming at us and before which we're helpless, and on the other hand the idea that we can resist.
I bagweda podaga to lead bit na ka kwena ka ba choose na ka ba kutaweda a character. Dati ko ne ba mu ko la na kutaweda na pu la ka ke tho ba daga la na ka ba kwe ri le pu ni la akhoti kho bo ni do keweda orphan ba mod over do the so ba the so ni our good class away our me ba daga la o do ta tu su ta ge either do ba du da daga to la ta mi ta ba ni fight na ka ba user person process ako ta ni do pa me ge la pu me ge ba ti ta pha ni lo di to ba du da ni boxer ba thu da daga to la Basana gini ni awal di pala ta sultan awal nak saja na awal nak saja ni mid jua mid lagi ya le no kuno ko ta bagi udah le koplo ba person serta asal lagi awal ta sultan le na awal saya ni mi pala lo awal bakal saya lo ini tu koplo le ta uta le tiko ta tu buku pun ini awe buah kenyo pun dikira gila awe bat bedo buah kenyo pun lada sudah nane bak kado bisa ya ke yon ini lada bersero bak kalau buah kenyo pun tablo kan ni buah kenyo pun matu pleo mabu pleo ke ini awe bela bagi bela ui do dikema mana mana do awe ke roki bersero ki do sudah lada buah kenyo pun dipak wani lo.
Benny and Ken have such a beautiful and honest love story, right? It's not a fairy tale, right? As beautiful as their meeting is, right? There are real costs to what they go through. to his imprisonment, to the war, to her fight to keep the family alive. Can you talk about what it was like to inhabit those characters and to craft those scenes when you talk about sort of the raw failures of love that come in war?
I mentioned before having, that what was absent from the story that I received from my family was the internal, the psychological toll. One of the first questions I asked myself was, what was it like for Benny and Kin, my grandparents were the characters based on my grandparents, to come together again after 3 years of being separated, years during which they had gone through incredible suffering, but also years during which they had experienced beauty, in some cases with other people, transformative beauty with other people. What was it like to come together again after all that time and try to make a go of marriage? My grandfather was thrown into house arrest. In fact, he'd been held in prison for those 3 years and tortured. So there was a little period during which he was free, but then they were sort of prisoners under the same roof. And what had been already a difficult marriage, because there were linguistic and cultural differences at play, became a marriage that was marked by deep resentment in a way, and deep alienation really, because of what they had gone through when they were apart. And there was no way really ultimately for them to overcome what had happened. And as a novelist, I didn't want to diminish what had happened to them by oversimplifying it. So my goal in treating the marriage, because this book is very much about a marriage, my goal with every scene between them was to really bring out all those layers of feeling that we can have for people to whom we're bound, but also with whom we might have an overlay of resentment and desperation. Just to give you a concrete example of what I mean, and then I'll stop so I don't go on too long before the translation. But for example, let's just say I were to meet a person for the first time in years with whom I'd had maybe I'd had a relationship with that person's now spouse. There might be feelings of embarrassment and shyness. I don't know if they are aware of this. I might simultaneously feel aware that they're not being kind to their spouse, so I might feel justified and angry in a way, while at the same time feeling a kind of tender bond between us. That's what I'm talking about, those layers of feeling, and how our feelings can often be in contention with one another. We can feel 3 things that are diametrically opposed at the exact same moment about the exact same person. And that tangle of feeling, I think it can increase in any marriage. Forget about one that has been thwarted and uprooted by war.
Ya get up the take that game go now, like a bar, go with the no. La a puni, the pini, the block honey, long mabi, our good bala, the killer. Kane, our gay, the doggy way. Bada ho, bada duka, bada duka, la he, that duka. 30 the ulata duka polani, Tama Suma Sao, that torture, that Masuma Sao, the little. Kodani, no, Madawa Kia Batway, Lanagamada the Kakawani, Hibu Popuna Guinea Ridoshi, Agodani do, away Kutaweda, a poo, like a Gavada character, the little bit of one. The new guest over, Mamma Bala Coploida, Takoda Killer, Doma Kia Gosser, the Blondie dog, Takoda Kedomuno. Osatana Guinea, no, good bless away, do, away. We were Danny dog, Dana, Polata, Paul, me, Tatuda, or me, Ken, the Kazani dog, we glass a very papa, Dido, Atapita, Mankello Togo. When we were shaped, Tagoda Ken, O Ama, Osatana Tagoda Keller, away a pea or poo, or question my Wendy, Ulo, in a way of the thing.
One of the many things I love about the book is, as much as it's about Benny and Ken and Louisa, there's a rich constellation of characters that surround them. And the weaving of historical characters, so Lin Ten or Saleh, or Katie, right? And how you bring those characters to bear and how you navigate history. And I know it's something we talked about with Ewa, is you talked about the legend of Lin Ten in the community, right? So could you tell us a little bit about him and then a little bit how you navigated dealing with people with those huge reputations like your mother or like Lin Ten?
I grew up in this is the different. We have people that growing up in the border, the time border, and we have people that growing up inside in Burma, and we never learn about Korean history because we're not allowed to learn anything. We learn about the Burmese history, and that's why we didn't know anything about what was going on back in like 1950, 60 at that time. But when I was a child, I got told by my mom that General Linton, and when he came to the city where I was from, and he stayed one night with my grandparents, and that's all I know about him. But when I came to refugees camp and I met with a person, and he's still alive, he's about 80 or 90 years old. He lived in South Dakota. He told me about the story when Linton went back to Burma, talked about peace, for freedom for his people, and I barely heard a little bit about Linton, and that's all.
I think that what you just said is so important, actually, because one of the things I didn't mention and that I learned through the course of writing the book is that during those hundreds of years of enslavement, maybe I'm doing something wrong, of enslavement commenced by the ethnic Burmans. Should I just do that? Is that better? During those hundreds of years of enslavement by the, how's that? Yes, oh, better. The Karens say that, and I'm apt to believe it, that their hands were cut off if writing implements were found on their person, such that they lost their alphabet, such that they lost their spiritual texts, such that they lost their written ones, and such that they lost their written history. Coupled with that, there has been a centuries-long and ongoing virulent attempt on the part of the Burmans and their leadership to what's called Burmanize the country. And what that is an aggressive, an absolutely aggressive form of integration. Let me explain how aggressive it is. So I found a document among my mother's things after she died, and that this was an army document. And on it, it was confidential, and it was instructions from the head of the army, or the heads came from way up high, to soldiers, and how much money they were going to get paid if they took advantage of, I'll put it that way, took advantage of non-Burman women in certain ethnic minority areas in order to basically water down the race and the minority races and forcibly Burmanize, by blood even, the country. So the fact that you didn't know Karen history is merely a symptom of this aggressive campaign of Burmanization that's been going on for centuries. And so when I began not only to understand that, but then to find a concomitant absence in even Western scholarly literature about the ethnic minority peoples of Burma, including the Karens. And when I discovered, when I was interviewing Karens, that actually they didn't know about their history for a reason, it became that much more important to me, and this is to answer your question, Louisa, yes, it's a novel in which I imagine the inner lives of people, and those inner lives are human, really. They're not, ultimately they're human. On the other hand, all the history and politics in the book are as factual as I could possibly make them.
နော်အမိုးတစ်ခုတီးပါဆက်တော့နေနေနော်အဝဲလေဖာဝဲတာဘီယောနော်ဘဒို document အလေတာကွဲကတိတဖာအိုဝဲစာထော်လနော်ခုနလာအဒုဒတကဒီလက်စဖို့တကနော်ဘာဟေဆိုဟေကမောဟေအလနော်ခုဖာle mima pwe amuda no tegala la ni do ba he o le khu pha di de phat no do tala ka ba ma we ni no ko pyo bu ni awe di e do we le the ko pyo pho di de phat no klu ga nyaw ni do soti man ne the pwa pyo pho di de phat ko ti yo ko lo klu du le asi aska di de phat ni no ba do ba da thyo ta klu le ko white no ka maloma gwe khel lo Asada apa kenyom migi keluga la bu pemalu pani do awadi ba tu bawe la no kemalo mak wira khela ke sini lo no aku tani do tagi la padati nya gi betu beti ta ba ri beklo la nya ti de pani khoplo la no padu bu pa ti de pani draw it te lo no movement ta hu ta ke o ni do do pa ti de pani ni ya zui no ta so ja so koloma go do Tezi go well no amiti cluella attack quegi a claw, pag a clone dog, plot a way you cop, no my thought touch your damo. I put an attack you put an in but not quegi a clod baba, Katugi a clod baba, Coboletta for Coney dog, no that's what him and who put an in.
I think it is what is so powerful about Miss Burma, about the story, is that both are needed. Both the rigorous history that you bring, that so many people don't know, both here in the US and those who've been denied their own history communicate so beautifully in the fiction that they're full humans, both in history as a people and as individuals. The very thing your mom navigates when she's used as a symbol, right? When she's, because if you don't know from the book, Louisa was held up as a symbol of Burmanization, as of a unity, right? Not as this beautiful woman who was both Karen and Jewish, right? But under this myth of one country, under the Burmans, right? That you both give her back her heart. You give her back the richness of her emotions, her imperfections, right? And you give that to Benny and Ken, but you also give back the history.
I'm curious about your writing process in going at a book like this where you're creating characters but they're based on people in your own family. Did you feel a tension between trying to be true to the characters you created and trying to do right by your own family?
Absolutely. It took me a long time to do that. There was another version of the book. In that version, a totally different version of the book that I wrote first. In fact, it's been 15 years that I've been working on this book. I did have 2 kids in the meantime, and I will say there were years when I was lousy at writing and teaching and mothering. But so that means 11 years writing this book. And I think that part of why it took so long was this question of getting past my allegiance to who the people were really and making them into characters in the way that I described before, distilling them, if you will, into sort of a central mixed motivation or a central kind of gesture and question. So in my grandfather's case, is it possible to belong? In my grandmother's case, Kin, who had experienced a real atrocity in her youth where Burman bandits had burst into her family home or hut and disemboweled her father in front of her eyes. And so for her, the central affliction or question really became, why go on in the face of this kind of persecution and suffering and evil, really? That took time, but this other version of the book was a much simpler story with one woman who was very based on my mother at the end of her life in the United States, narrating her story to her American daughter, very much based on me. And really that story featured immigration, I would say, and the inheritance of trauma, and cleaved much more to my experience of my real mother. And far in the background was Burma's history and politics. And I showed that to just 2 or 3 people, editors, who had a similar reaction, which is, it's interesting, it's compelling, but why are you avoiding the subject of history and politics in Burma and the Karens? And that was a wake-up call for me. And once I sort of submitted, in a way, to featuring the history and politics, it was somehow easier to turn my family members into characters.
Kaluga la hoko no do be ketinya ke bagana da so deso kana hu da ka phawa wa ni amni bola na futa na family na la ke wada character la lewe ya bu le do ba mni bola awe ba oku no awe tu da do la oku ni no phi do aku no ata mu ata le khop do age glo ba mni bola awe ba ma we le ni do a phi do aku ata le khop lo ata so deso ni tu do we do ta le khop to le aba thwe do ti lu ko te no ta so ti ma na de pa la a phi ni no Burman no pe yo no atu ni ma ti yo le amati a phi a pa la me nya no la me nya ni ki ne pata ma ti ma wo a phi we ni tu wa ta no ble wa ta le khop lo wa ta so ti ma ne ko ta no ta tu ba we no tu ba the the ko ni ba mnu ko le yi de kwe pla tho di pa mi le ni do o la ta ko tho ko lo le we ni no a we kwe wa da a claw version la ga o de kha no do le de we ni ke tho ko ni no wa ba tek to da ti chi ta ni a pho ki ga wa so da la university do adapita ma ni mo de ga do ni busy a ko da ni do no le de ke tho ko ni no a jang da sit ni ne wa ba ko class we la do awen na we le ata ko class ni ko do no ba ga ti nya ke pa nyo age glo da tu wa kho ba ata hello sir na this is the so de pan lo.
After writing the book, who can you say that you most associate yourself with?
Are you speaking ethnically?
Characters, yes.
Oh, which of the characters? Well, the character that's closest to my heart is Saleh, which is interestingly a made-up character, or a character that's most imagined. Just to tell others who that is, my grandfather is Benny, my grandmother Kin, and my mother is Louisa. But early on in their marriage, Benny meets a Karen man named Saleh, who was sort of modeled a little bit initially on a friend of my grandparents named Salbele. And so he shares some of Salbele's qualities. He's a national football hero, intelligent, a Karen leader. But I let myself go more with my imagination with him because I had never met this man in real life. And I allowed him, he becomes an interpreter for the husband and wife because he's very fluent in English. Of course, he's fluent in Karen. And as he interprets, he becomes extremely close to Benny and becomes a sort of political ally for Benny. But he also falls in love with Kin. But he's also a deeply spiritual man. And I think is able to think in a very nuanced way for me about some of the Karen attributes that are so precious, such as the way that they're conciliatory sometimes by nature, or perhaps what an American would even say is meek, but which is a spiritual value in their eyes. He's able to really look at that and love it, and yet also sort of stand apart from it and see how the Burmans or people in the West might be critical of that. And I think that that reflects the collision of a lot within myself. You know, that I feel very Karen by nature, and yet I was raised here, and I can kind of put on a very Western hat. I'm spiritual by nature, and yet I've been forced to pretend I'm not in certain, let's say, at Harvard or certain academic contexts. So he's the closest to me.
But when on the way ni no, that is one ni ne na sukumu no but when on the way ni no di me buat di le tegale no na character the way ni no but when do way ni di le tegale me kwa ni sal ba ni awe tu ni do me kanyo twi no a phi do a phu ben ni ne ke phu khin ni do ke da phi no wo do ta ko ta ga no nga mi ni le tam ka bailing no soft bailing no awe ni ne ke no pa ta ga la ka to klo thi da la a phi do a phu wa sa no a phu ne ka to la ko la wa a phi ni do la pyo do kanyo bo da ni do awe ka to klo thi da cái đó thì đó cô đi cô ta nó ra tập đó con đi đó về đời đã về chạy đó bắt đã khen gì đời đã phơi mà nó bỏ nó về bắt đã về gì ra từ nay cái này nó ở cái này tập la bà và cái nhỏ cái là về quê này đó nó so về này đó ở cái pha đi chơi phụ lòng đó hồi đó này là ở về đã con này bắt theo đó lệ về đi lệ này đó là phi đi cái bà này sẽ được bà đi hết là sẽ được bà cái nhỏ mà từ nay cái hết đu thọ hết play thọนี่ว่าถ้าว่ากูตีแล้วก็อเมริกาก็ตอนนี้ดอถ้าสมมุติมีกี่ถ้าเอาเท่าเราแค่เลยแค่เส้นนี้ดอบ้านช่วยกินละอเมริกาดูดเสร็จนะบ้านช่วยกินละไปนี่ดูดเสร็จปุ๊บนะไม่มีละเลี้ยวไว้อะไรฮะนี่อุดาเอาไว้ช่วยเราไว้ได้สมมุตินะตีกว่าตีดูนะดอดูแค่เราได้เลี้ยวไว้แล้วอักษรเอาไว้แค่ได้ใครได้กันนะตัวบ้าน
I was just wondering if you had to travel to Burma, if people were willing to speak with you when you were asking them about their histories of
Asking if I had been to Burma and were people willing to speak to me. My mother had a price on her head because she was considered an enemy of the state. So I have never been into really the Delta region, and I still haven't gone, and I still don't know now with this book if I will go. That's a question. I'd love any feedback on that. But I've gone twice. The first time I was about 22 years ago, and I went with my sister. So it was still, the war was still going on very much with the Karens, and we went through, we got to visit a lot of refugee areas and camps, and then go into the Gothule at the time, which is sort of this central headquarter, or Karen land, you might say. And it was very meaningful because I felt everything from an immediate sense of belonging. It's like, in a way, I realized that here I've always sort of, I don't know if it's a cultural thing and everyone feels this or only I feel it, but just, I'm always sort of like this, and then I just was able to relax. On the other hand, about 1 minute after I got there, and my sister and I said, oh, I feel like we came home. We're walking down the street, and then some kid said, no, like Galua, I mean, I'm probably not pronouncing that well, but good evening, white people. So immediately we were like, oh, we don't fully belong here either, but I went again after my mother passed away in 2012 with the mission of interviewing people and finding out more, and that was a really different experience in terms of the belonging. I absolutely felt I belonged. I absolutely felt like I was able to relax and kind of just be, in a way, in this egalitarian mode that comes much more naturally to me. People were very open, talking about everything that they could think of, and but I felt pressured in an opposite way. One Karen man said to me, what are you? Are you Karen or are you American? And I said, I'm half-half. He said, that's not the right answer. I wanted 100% Karen. So, it's been this, the trips were really representative to me of how I think I've been sort of, I don't know, internally Karen and externally American, I would say, and that was reflected back to me on the trips.
ที่ก็ไปอีไม่มีเลยตุลตาพิธีอันนี้ปัจจุบันปากญอก็แล้วไม่ปากญอบุแล้วเอาเกี่ยวกับเรื่องอาบุบีอันนี้คิดสิคิดนี่เกี่ยวกับล้อแล้วเกี่ยวกับนี่พลวัตแล้วเอาไว้นี่จะที่ก็แล้วที่ก็แล้วเนาะจะบิลังให้แล้วเนาะเกี่ยวกับนับเวมุเป็นนี่ภาษาก็กระโดดปากญอก็นี่ละเกี่ยวอะไรเกี่ยวกับอะไรเนาะเอาไว้อันนี้ดอกกระเตวดอกเตวเป็นบ้านเราitu pak kata lo bebe le no orang boleh no pakai dia jadi cuy lupa pak no kan nanti doa ni lo aku ciri itu kedua ni pak akan ni doa perlu pak lepas ada ni lo kalau ki mana doa kalau perlu tak kedua apa kedua ki kenyau lo lupa aku ni no kau tak kau tak kena go no le perlu pak le jadi kenyau sesel lo ni doa tinggi lo pak no aku tadi awak doa dia ni doa tapi kenyau dua ni kalau dua ni samaเราปากยอดได้กันนี่เจอได้เราก็ปากเกี่ยวกับ100%พวกเราในแก่ต้องดูว่าได้มาหมอนะหมอเอาไว้จะเลยความรู้เพลและอโมบุตีบุเลบุบีและคีโตจะซีคีนี่เอาไว้กี่ตัวเลยกี่คือที่ยากี่ตาตัวละหมอจะไม่ละกี่ตัวแบบเลือกว่าอะไรบาดเจ็บไปอีโอไปจะไม่บ้านะแต่กี่ว่าเป็นแต่กี่อัพโหลดนี่เราสอนยี่เล่นยาตัวละนะเอาคนนั้นก็ตัวได้นะอะไรพวกแกสบายนะเอาคนนั้นนี่ดอนะบาดที่นี่เนาะแค่อีแล้วเอาไว้คุยเลยพอคนนี้ดอกเนาะเอาไว้กินได้แล้วบุกิตเตลบ้าเนาะมาซากินนี่พอแล้วอุลก็ไปเอาบุแล้วพอเนี่ยก็ได้ผ่านเอาได้โอเปนเนาะดีกว่าตะกี้ตะกุนี่ดอกเดี๋ยวนั่นได้แค่แล้วเนาะเอาไว้ดอกเดี๋ยวนั่นทำเลยดอกดีกว่าดอกเอาไว้สิสนาทีละ